The story of the Nomad and the Hummingbird has been probably the most interesting narrative choice that this season of Megalobox has introduced, and depending on who you view the Nomad and Hummingbird as, that should tell you the way the season will end. The way I'm looking at it is this is my line of thought. The show starts off with Chief being the Hummingbird for Joe the Nomad's story. The Hummingbird leads the Nomad back home. Joe ended up going back home, he made amends, but Chief ended up dying, and of course the Nomad had to watch and bury the Hummingbird. One would assume Joe is the Hummingbird of this story. He's wearing Chief's armor, it's been repurposed to fit his body and physique, but the Hummingbird seemingly leads the Nomad back home before dying. So you would assume Joe ends up dead and Mac gets to go home. The horrible bastard says he has to win. To me, what I'm viewing this as is the Hummingbird will lead the Nomad, Mac, back home. Mac will probably win next week's match. However, I don't think the Hummingbird dying is a literal sense for Joe. Joe said this is his last match no matter what. Win or lose, this will be his last match. So either A, they're going to go very symbolic with it, his gear will break and that will be destroyed and he'll lose, or it will just be his defeat because Joe will be retiring, so the death will basically be Joe no longer boxing. I'm not saying Joe or Mac or both couldn't end up dead next week, they absolutely could. But given how they're directing it and just the way the armor is being put on Joe and things like that, I feel like Mac will win, but Joe's death, quote unquote, will be him no longer boxing and potentially the gear being destroyed in the match, but Chief protecting Joe one last time because Chief, even in death, will always be the Hummingbird for the Nomad Joe story. Hopefully that train of thought is something that you can kind of follow, and I think it would be amazing if, like, the death blow or Mac time happens, and, you know, we're building up, Joe is about to die, and it looks like Mac has won, Mac time has killed Joe, the armor breaks, but Joe gets up because Chief, for one last time, protected Joe and led him back home. Wouldn't that be a really interesting way to kind of conclude the Nomad story? I don't think we need a death in order for this show to be amazing. Hell, I mean, had this not been an anime where you could have just said the match isn't going to happen, I think both Joe and Mac probably could have just walked away here. But I think that'd be a really interesting turn of events, but either way, next week's episode, episode 13, is bound to be the most emotional fight that Megalobox has ever seen. And I mean, for a season with not that much boxing, all things considered, I think they're going to go absolutely all out with it. I loved Joe's content in this episode. I love seeing Hsieh do what he knows best and what he enjoys doing. Seeing why Chief's gear was the way it was, how for a body like Chief it was very good even though it was restricted with the movements, so they have to redesign it to fit Joe's body so he can still punch. Teaching Joe what he's learning here isn't about winning, it's about letting him go back home. Basically all tying together with what I just said, right? I mean, Joe winning is probably the least likely scenario here. Mac has the physique, Mac has, honestly, Mac time for better or worse. So it's really not about Joe winning here, I think it's about Joe surviving. So if the gear is modified properly, Joe doesn't go all out, you know, I really feel like Joe could make it back home alongside Mac. And I personally think, even though I would say Chief is my favorite character in Megalobox, and especially the best new character in this season, I think Mac is just as well written as Chief himself. I think Mac is an incredibly good guy who was dealt a shitty hand, and he, you know, almost drunk himself to an early grave. Him meeting up with his former police pals and just going over everything that happened, I mean, especially with playing the ending song, which is one of the most beautiful pieces of music I've heard all year, and him reminiscing about the past and all the bad things that happened, him understanding that he can't blame the wife. He would have done the exact same thing, put in her shoes. Something I was really hoping was going to happen because, I mean, you can understand how people might be able to form a line of thought. The wife did this horrible thing, forced it on her husband to save her kid, but any parent would have done the exact same thing, especially if they loved their kid, which is something that's supposed to be happening there, right? So just watching it all take place and how they're both building up to wanting to go back home. You could argue the biggest death flags right now are on Joe, just given the fact that compared to how Mac is interacting with his family, compared to how Joe's interacting with Yuri, it feels a lot more hopeless on Joe's side than it does on Mac's side. But if one character will end up dead, I would be more shocked if it was Joe, because I feel like that's the obvious plot line, but I don't think obvious is always a bad thing. If Joe ended up dead and he had a smile on his face, I don't think I'd feel cheated or anything like that. I mean, he did get to go back home, he did get to make amends, but it just feels to me that both of these characters are going to lead each other home. Chief will still be protecting Joe because he's wearing his gear, And I think, honestly, Joe is protecting Mac in a certain sense and leading him back home, because if Joe does end up losing, I mean, at that point, he has no reason to continue pushing his, horrible military agenda on the guy. But at the same time, if Joe ended up beating Mac, what would that do for public images? Would Mac be treated very horribly? There's a lot of shit going on there, but I think the whole idea of the one woman who's been working with this son of a bitch who just dances the night away, it feels like she's onto something and she's going to be the big exposer of everything like that. And I'm hoping that this man doesn't get to continue on his bullshit adventures, because he's a piece of shit. The technology is innovative, it changes our lives forever, but it's not ready for public marketing because the data that's available for public has been falsified by this man so that he can make a shit ton of money. So it's like, there's so many things at play, but I do feel like with episode 13, they will stick the landing, and I think I'm going to come out saying the exact same thing I did with season 1. I don't need any more Megalobox. And then probably 3 years later, I'll hear about season 3 of Megalobox and I'll say, give me more, damn it. It's one of those shows. Whether Joe lives or dies, you can always make more characters. I mean, look at Chief, look at Mac. Either one of those characters, imagine if Joe died in season 1. Either one of those characters could have been a compelling main character for this story, right? But by having Joe still remain in the focal point for a while here, I think there's still so much more potential. Joe lives, he gets to be a coach in season 3 or a mentor in season 3. Joe dies, I mean, just write another character. Or maybe we leave it off with episode 26, we never touch Megalobox again. I like, though, that the creators are the type of people that say, we'll make more if the idea's there, but we're not just gonna keep making more just so we can make a quick profit. They basically said as such in interviews. You can find the videos on Crunchyroll's YouTube channel. Just search up Megalobox Season 2 interviews. It's really interesting how they directed and kind of like presented this season, because you don't get to see creators say that too much. The entire reason that we even got Season 2 was because they had a really good idea, not because they had to make more to make another profit and kind of ride that legacy of tomorrow's Joe, since, well, Megalobox is a reimagining as such. But given the fact that Megalobox Season 2 has been such a departure from the original source material, and definitely has took more leeway to branch off and do new things, that's why I feel like both of these characters could see the light of day. I really hope I don't get a multitude of comments if, like, Joe, Mac, or both end up dead. People are like, see, you're wrong, you speculate completely wrong. Part of the fun of watching anime is being able to look at the content and think, where could it go from here? And there's so many ways for this to end very positively or negatively, and either of those options, even if they make it in more of a middle ground, one character lives, one character dies, it all will work for me. It's all about the directing and execution. And for nearly 12 weeks, I've said Megalobox Season 2 Nomad will probably be my anime of the year. That's how much I like it, and even if somehow episode 13 was a bit of a dip in quality, I still don't see why I would say anything as such than this is my anime of the season and probably going to be my anime of the year. It's emotional, it's well directed, there isn't a bad character in this show. Even this man right here, right? He is, without a doubt, the scummiest piece of shit in this show. However, really well-written character to get across that kind of, like, money-making, hungry bastard, and you wouldn't have it any other way. I'm honestly very excited to see next week's episode. I'm not terrified, I'm not scared. If Joe, Mac, or both end up dead, I mean, I'm sure it's going to serve a good narrative purpose. However, I am holding on to the hope that both might make it out alive, but I guess we'll see. If my predictions are completely wrong, I'm perfectly fine with that. I mean, there's plenty of ways to write this in very different ways, positive and negative, and I think they would all work, but I guess we'll see where it goes. If next week's episode does suck, I'll admit as such, but I really don't see how they'll mess up the landing, but I guess we'll see, right? Let me know your thoughts and feelings, and definitely your theories down below. Where do you think it's going to go next week? Drop a like to help promote the video, and subscribe if you're new around here. So until next time, everyone, please take care and have a good one.